that must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted. Gender-based violence must be condemned anytime, anywhere. Mr. President, according to the de facto authorities, more than 14,000 people have been killed since the start of the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have also been injured, with many more missing. In Gaza, more than 2/3 of those killed are reported to be children and women. In a matter, the total number of children killed during any year by any party to a conflict since I've been Secretary General, as clearly indicated in the annual reports on children and armed conflict that I have submitted to the Council. Over the past few days, the people of the occupied Palestine territory and Israel have finally seen a glimmer of hope and humanity in so much darkness. It is deeply moving to see civilians finally having a respite from the bombardments, families reunited, and life-saving aid increasing. Mr. President, Resolution 2712, and I quote, demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children. It is clear that before the pause, we witnessed serious violations. Beyond the many civilians killed and wounded that I have spoke of, 80% of Gaza's people have now been forced from their homes. This growing population is being pushed towards an ever smaller area of southern Gaza, and of course, nowhere is safe in Gaza. Meanwhile, an estimated 45% of all homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The nature and scale of death and destruction are characteristic of the use of wide-area explosive weapons in populated areas with a significant impact on civilians. At the same time, rocket attacks on population centers in Israel by Hamas and other groups have continued, along with allegations of the use of human shields. This is also inconsistent with international humanitarian law obligations. Mr. President, I want to stress the inviolability of United Nations facilities, which today are sheltering more than 1 million civilians seeking protection under the UN flag. UNRWA shares the coordinates of all its facilities across the Gaza Strip with all parties to the conflict. The agency has verified 104 incidents that have impacted 82 UNRWA installations, 24 of which happened since the adoption of the resolution. A total of 218 internally displaced people sheltering in 894 injured. In addition, it is with immense sadness and pain that I report that since the beginning of the hostilities, 111 members of our UN family have been killed in Gaza. This represents the largest loss of personnel in the history of our organization. Let me put it plainly. Civilians, including United Nations personnel, must be protected. Civilian objects, including hospitals, must be protected. UN facilities must not be hit. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties to the conflict at all times. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2712 calls, and I quote, for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip to enable full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. End of quote. I welcome the arrangement reached by Israel and Hamas with the assistance of the governments of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States. We are working to maximize the positive potential of this arrangement on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The pause has enabled us to enhance the delivery of aid into and across Gaza. For example, for the first time since 7th October, An interagency convoy delivered food, water, medical supplies, and shelter items to northern Gaza, especially to 4 UNRWA shelters in Jabalia camp. Prior to this, minimal or no assistance had reached these locations, even as tens of thousands of people had crowded there for shelter. Also, for the first time, supplies of cooking gas entered Gaza, where people waited in lines that extended for 2 kilometers. In the south, where the needs are dire, UN agencies and partners have increased both the amount of aid delivery and the number of locations reached. And I express my appreciation to the government of Egypt for their contribution in making this assistance possible. But the level of aid to Palestinians in Gaza remains completely inadequate to meet the huge needs of more than 2 million people. And although the total volume of fuel allowed into Gaza has also increased, it remains utterly insufficient to sustain basic operations. Civilians in Gaza need a continuous flow of life-saving humanitarian aid and fuel into and across the area. Safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need is critical. Humanitarian partners carried out several medical evacuations from North to South Gaza, including to transport dozens of premature babies, as well as spinal and dialysis patients from Shifa and Al-Ahli Anglican hospitals. Several critically ill patients have also been evacuated for treatment in Egypt. Hospitals across Gaza lack the basic supplies, staff and fuel to deliver primary health care at the scale needed, let alone safely treat urgent cases. The medical system has broken down under the heavy caseload, acute shortages, and the impact of hostilities. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2712 calls for, and I quote, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. The arrangements announced on 22 November has so far led to the release over 5 days of 60 hostages, 29 women, 31 children, held by Hamas and other groups since 7 October. Outside the arrangement during the same period, another 21 hostages were released. I have been saying from day one, all hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Until then, they must be treated humanely, and the International Committee of the Red Cross must be allowed to visit them. The arrangement also saw the release of 180 Palestinian prisoners and detainees from Israeli jails, mostly women and children. Mr. President, Security Council Resolution 2712, and I quote, calls on all parties to refrain from depriving the civilian population in the Gaza Strip of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival, consistent with international humanitarian law. Much more is required to begin to address human needs in Gaza. Water and electricity services must be fully restored. Food systems have collapsed and hunger is spreading, particularly in the north. Sanitary conditions in shelters are appalling, with few toilets and sewage flooding posing a serious threat to public health. Children, pregnant women, older people, and those with weakened immune systems are at greater risk. Gaza needs an immediate and sustained increase in humanitarian aid, including food, water, fuel, blankets, medicines, and healthcare supplies. It is important to recognize that the Rafah border crossing does not have enough capacity, especially taking into account the slow pace of security procedures. That is why we have been urging the opening of other crossings, including Kerem Shalom, and the streamlining of inspection mechanisms to allow for the necessary increase of life-saving aid. But humanitarian aid alone will not be sufficient. We also need the private sector to bring in critical basic commodities to replenish completely depleted shops in Gaza. Mr. President, finally, Security Council Resolution 2712, and I quote, underscores the importance of coordination, humanitarian notification, and deconfliction mechanisms to protect all medical and humanitarian staff, vehicles including ambulances, humanitarian sites, and critical infrastructure, including UN facilities. A humanitarian notification system is now in place and is being constantly reviewed and enhanced, including through plans for additional civil-military experts to support coordination. Mr. President, I welcome the adoption of Resolution 2712, but its implementation by the partners matters most. In accordance with the resolution, I will revert to the President of the Security Council with a set of options on effectively monitoring the implementation of the resolution. I've already established a working group composed of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department of Peace Operations, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the Office of Legal Affairs to urgently prepare proposals in this regard. So far, it is clear that implementation has been only partial at best, and it was woefully insufficient. Ultimately, we know that the measure of success will not be the number of trucks dispatched or the tons of supplies delivered, as important as these are. Success will be measured in lives that are saved, suffering that is ended, and open dignity that is restored. The people of Gaza are in the midst of an epic humanitarian catastrophe before the eyes of the world. We must not look away. Intense negotiations are taking place to prolong the truce, which we strongly welcome, but we believe we need a true humanitarian ceasefire. And we must ensure the people of the region finally have a horizon of hope. Reversible way towards establishing a two-state solution on the basis of United Nations resolutions and international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. Failure will condemn Palestinians, Israelis, the region and the world to a never-ending cycle of death and destruction, and I thank you.
感谢秘书长的发言。
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing.
请温尼
I now
斯
give
兰
the
德先
floor to
生
Mr.
通
Tor
报
Wennesland.
情况，有请。
Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Security Council. Following the Secretary General's statement, I will focus my briefing on dynamics in the occupied West Bank, the region, and where we go from here in the context of the unfolding conflict between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza. Before doing so, I wish to join the Secretary Generals in acknowledging the efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and US in facilitating an agreement that has secured the release of 60 Israeli hostages from Gaza so far, resulted in a 6-day pause in fighting, which allowed the UN to scale up humanitarian aid, as well as led to the release of 180 Palestinian prisoners and detainees from Israeli custody. Such respite from weeks of horror is long overdue. Mr. President, while the world's attention has been rightly focused on the devastating violence and outbreaks of hostility since 7 October, we are also witnessing a heightened tension, intensive violence, and widespread movement restrictions across the occupied West Bank. The period has been marked by some of the most intensive Israeli operations in the West Bank since the Second Intifada, involving the use of improvised explosive devices by armed Palestinians and drone strikes by Israeli security forces. Tulkarem and Jenin has seen the largest scale Israeli operations, including inside the refugee camps. Settler violence has also continued at high levels, driving mounting tension and increased violence, as well as Palestinian displacements. In all, 154 Palestinians, including 37 children, have been killed this reporting period in the West Bank. Nearly all of them in the context of Israeli operations, many involving armed exchanges with Palestinians. 2 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli settlers. 3 Israelis, including 2 security forces, were killed by Palestinian attacks. Mr. President, amid the surging violence and extensive Israeli movement restriction, the Palestinian Authority's long-standing fiscal crisis have worsened significantly as economic activity in the West Bank has grown to a halt and the economy of Gaza collapsed. The 2nd November decision by the Israeli Security Cabinet to deduct, quote, all funds designed for Gaza Strip, unquote, from the clearance revenue Israeli transferred to the PA further weakened revenues, impacting many critical services and the payment of public sector salaries, including to the security forces. The situation is boiling and getting worse rapidly. In the months before the war, I warned regularly in this council that more must be done to help stabilize the situation in the West Bank. That is more the case now than ever before. Mr. President, a few words on the regional dynamics and my continued concern about the risk for further escalation. Turning to Israel's north, while tension along the blue line have calmed in recent days, the situation remains volatile, and it was through the reporting period. Approximately 100,000, 50,000 Lebanese are displaced from southern areas near the blue line. On the Golan, firing from Syria towards the Israeli-occupied Golan and strikes by Israelis against targets in Syria took place. From further afield, missiles and drones were also reportedly launched from Yemen towards Israel. Most were intercepted. However, drone strikes claimed by the Houthis hit a school in Eilat on 9 November. A ship affiliated to an Israeli businessman was seized by Houthis forces in the Red Sea on 19 November. Mr. President, the dizzying pace of events and staggering needs on the ground make it difficult to see beyond the most immediate challenges. Nevertheless, we must begin work on what comes next. Without an effective political and security framework for when the fighting ceases, it will be impossible to sustainably end the violence and shape a new reality. Over the coming weeks and months, the international community must increase their engagement with Israel, the PA, and regional partners on constructive and practical political solutions. While much is unknown about how this war will end, some absolutes are clear. Acts of terror, like those Hamas and others committed against Israel on October 7th, must never be allowed to happen again. And Palestinians in Gaza must never ever again experience the horrors they have endured. Gaza is and must remain an integral part of a future Palestinian state, with both Gaza and West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. The only viable path is one that leads to an end of the occupation and the realization of a two-state solution in line with UN resolutions, previous agreements, and international law. Our past efforts have certainly not been enough. A message that resonates in particular today as we mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. There must be a new and different approach, or we are doomed to return to the path of managing a conflict that clearly cannot be managed. Thank you.
Finish? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Winnisland.
通报。我现在请观察员国
I now give the floor
巴勒斯坦外交
to
与
His
侨民事
Excellency
务部
Mr.
长
Riyad al-Maliki, Minister of
先生
Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the
请发
Observer
言
State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank you for your decision to hold this meeting at ministerial level and for sharing it. I thank all the ministers who decided to attend, and notably the Arab and OIC ministers who have been touring the world to advocate for an end of the Israeli aggression. I also wish to thank the Secretary General for his briefing and his efforts, and the United Nations for their vital role on the ground. Mr. President, Khalid, a grandfather, held his 3-year-old granddaughter, Reem, smiling at her, kissing her, saying comforting words to her, opening her eyes repeatedly, calling her the soul of my soul, just before laying her and her 5-year-old brother, Tariq, to rest. So many leaving this earth way too early and in the most brutal way. And so many shattered lives and bodies are yet to be given the chance to mourn and heal to the extent possible after such tragedies and pain. Anyone still not sure they are against what is happening or that it needs to end should check their humanity. Life in Gaza must prevail over those who aim to destroy it or uproot it. We thank Qatar and Egypt for their efforts that led to a truce. But a truce must become a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. The massacres cannot be allowed to resume. This is not a war. This is a carnage that nothing and no one can justify. It must be brought to an end. Mr. President, we had said early on that the humanitarian catastrophe cannot be prevented. People held captive cannot be released. Regional escalation cannot be avoided without a stop to the Israeli assault against the Palestinian people in Gaza. What we see now confirms what we have said then. Thousands of lives could have been spared. The momentum we are finally witnessing now must be sustained. Families must be reunited in life, not in death. The dire needs of our people in Gaza must be addressed throughout the Gaza Strip without further delay and constraints. People must be allowed to go back to their homes and start rebuilding their lives. The siege imposed by Israel must be lifted. Mr. President, over 15,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. Over 10,000 of them are women and children. They have been killed by Israel. They did not lose their lives. It was taken away. No one is safe in Gaza. Not the children, not the doctors, not the humanitarian personnel, not the journalists, not the UN staff. They were killed at an unprecedented pace in modern history. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Not the north, not the south, not UN shelters, not schools, not hospitals, not ambulances, not homes, not streets, not mosques, not churches. People were being killed everywhere. International humanitarian law was enacted to protect these people and these places. And instead of being spared, they were targeted. Israel keeps giving examples from the Second World War to justify its crimes, ignoring that it is the very horrors that occurred then that led humanity to enact the fundamental rules Israel is breaching now. How many times can the world afford to fail the test of humanity in Gaza, in Palestine? How many times can it afford to fail the test of legality? Mr. President, we are at a historic crossroad, and we are out of time. A solvable political conflict is being turned into a never-ending religious confrontation. Our people are faced with an existential threat. Make no mistake about it. With all the Palestine that is facing a plan to destroy it, implemented in broad daylight, enacted in laws and in policies, carried out with brutality by soldiers and by settlers. We are being erased from the map, literally. Netanyahu, from the podium of the General Assembly, announced a new Middle East where Palestine had vanished. It is no coincidence that in the map he raised at this occasion, both the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip were considered part of Israel, alongside the Syrian Golan. We are being pushed out of history and geography. Israel calls it voluntary resettlement. They are just suggesting it for our own sake. With siege and bombs that have led to the displacement of 1.7 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and with incursions and attacks by occupation forces and settlers. They have turned Gaza into hell on earth, and the lives of Palestinian communities in the West Bank into a living hell. On the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, they are trying to finish the job. 75 years later, Israel should rather be convinced that no force on earth can uproot Palestinians from Palestine, nor Palestine from the hearts of Palestinians, wherever they are. The Palestinian people are here to stay. They are from this land and of this land, and their destiny is to live in freedom and dignity on this land. Isn't it time we found a way to live side by side? We don't even need to search that hard for that way. It is enshrined in international law and the relevant UN resolutions. The fulfillment of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights and two states living side by side in peace and security on the pre-1967 borders. Mr. President, there are calls to avoid escalation in the West Bank, but the escalation is there. Since the 7th of October, over 230 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. 3,200 have been injured. 1,250 have been displaced, including 500 children. Thousands have been arrested, maimed, humiliated, harassed. So escalation is there. Or does it only become an escalation if Israelis are harmed? We know the entire world rejects Israel's colonial policies and violence and has been calling for accountability. But that accountability cannot come from a government whose agenda is the settlers' agenda, led by settlers, funding settlements, arming settlers, and the protection of our people cannot be ensured by the occupying forces who are complicit in these crimes. We need international protection and international action to end impunity so as to prevent the recurrence of these crimes that occur daily and in broad daylight. What our people are enduring now is the result of the international community's failure to provide such protection and accountability. Mr. President, Israel kills our children one generation after another. Killed 2 Palestinian children, gunned down by Israeli snipers. Adam, 8 years old, was shot in the head, and Basil, 15 years old, was shot in the chest. Israel maims our children one generation after another. Israel arbitrarily arrests our children one generation after another. As you feel relief to see those held captive in Gaza reunited with their loved ones, don't feel shame if you have the same feeling when you see a Palestinian mother reunited with her released son. Feel shame if you don't. Israel calls our children terrorists to justify killing them, arresting them, torturing them. They arrest them from their homes, from their beds, before dawn, traumatizing them and their families every day of every year. That must stop. The dehumanization and demonization of Palestinians have reached such depth, some could still wonder if there was not some explanation for flattening entire neighborhoods, leaving thousands under the rubble. Children, women, elderly, men killed indiscriminately and with total disregard for every legal rule and every human value. This dehumanization has consequences far beyond our borders, including here. It led to the stabbing of a 6-year-old and the shooting of 3 university students in the United States. Israel targets our children and then says we teach them hatred. The problem is not that our children are fed falsehoods, but that they are fed bombs and bullets, occupation and oppression, blockade and walls. We will confront those who try to justify the killing of our children and all those promoting double standards in the physical world or the virtual one, trying to silence those who convey their truth from under the bombs and those who stand in solidarity with Palestine. Israel believes there is an international law specific to it, designed to be compatible with their crimes. An international law that allows war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, an international law that applies not based on its actions, but on the identity of the perpetrator and the identity of the victim. Our stance remains unchanged. Vengeance is never the answer. Justice is. Our people should not be denied justice any further. The lives of Palestinians are not less sacred than the lives of any other people on earth. Justice will help us chart a path where no Palestinians and no Israelis are killed. Mr. President, Israel is trying to intimidate those criticizing it and defending the rule of international law across the globe, including governments that consider themselves allies of Israel, the Secretary General, and the UN agencies, human rights and humanitarian organizations. It also did not stop its undermining of the Palestinian National Authority on the political, financial, and security levels, nor its attacks against the Palestinian people as a whole. Israel is never to blame. Palestinians, of course. We are responsible for our own disposition, for our forcible displacement, for the occupation of our land, for the killing and maiming of our people, for the oppression and subjugation we are victims of. None of it is Israel's fault. Even as its leaders confess to their crimes, deny the very existence of our people, and pledge to spare no effort to prevent the independence of our state, they tell you that the obstacle to peace is not them. They are most than willing to make peace once we are dead or displaced, of course. Mr. President, we are a nation, and we have earned respect as a nation. The respect and solidarity of peoples around the world that is manifesting itself yet again these days, including on this International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are human beings, and we are owed respect to our inherent dignity as human beings. no one should dare to justify the killing of Palestinian civilians. Israel has no right to self-defense against the people it occupies, and that it is obligated to protect under international law. Israel has no right to security that trumps our right to life, to freedom, and self-determination. Israel is not seeking security. If it was, it would choose peace. Israel and this Israeli government, more than any other, considers that a strategic threat it is confronted to is Palestinian statehood. Netanyahu's selling point to keep his post is that he is the best positioned to obstruct Palestinian statehood in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And he repeated that in the last 2 days. The man in charge of the assault against our people is one whose very political survival depends on prolonging the massacres and continuing to deny Palestinian rights. His interests do not only conflict with our inalienable rights, but with all those who seek peace and security for all. Mr. President, Gaza has a very special place in our national history. Its name today is how many people spell Palestine around the world. It cannot be erased. Our people cannot be uprooted from it. Its Palestinianness cannot be altered. There is no Palestine without Gaza. Gaza bleeds. Gaza suffers. Gaza acts. But Gaza lives. And Palestine lives. Free Palestine, that is the only path to peace. Thank you.
感谢
I thank His Excellency Mr. Al-Maliki for
我现
his
在请
statement.
以色列
I
代
now
表
give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. On November 29th, 1947, the UN voted to adopt the partition plan and the establishment of the Jewish state. Yet, while Israel joyfully accepted this resolution, the Arab states rejected it and instead tried to annihilate Israel. Today, exactly 70 repeating itself. Foreign ministers of some Arab countries have arrived here today in order to support a terror organization that aims to annihilate Israel. Thankfully, the plan to eliminate Israel was unsuccessfully then, just as it will be unsuccessfully today. Despite Arab opposition, Israel was born. And not only did Israel survive their attack, but we thrived, becoming a powerhouse of impact, benefiting all of humanity, including our neighbors who live with us in peace. Distinguished Council members, this deep-seated hatred of Israel and Jews from even before its establishment until this very day stems from the very same genocidal ideology that drives Hamas. This is not a political conflict or about partitioning land. It is solely about the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews. Please look at this picture. This picture tells you everything you need to know about this conflict. This is Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and one of the founding fathers of Palestinian nationalism. Al-Husseini dedicated his life to ensuring that there would be no Jewish presence in Israel or in any Arab land. The Mufti's hate spread across the Levant, and tragically, he was partially successful in creating a Judenrein, Jew-free Middle East. His followers led the 1929 and the 1936 massacres in Israel. They were at the helm of the Farhud massacre in Baghdad in 1941 and other massacres against Jews in the Arab world. And it was the Mufti's ideology which sparked the expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. A century ago, Council members, over 1 million Jews lived in Arab countries. 1 million Jews. Yet today, there are only a couple thousands. Where did all the Jews disappear to? The Jews of Lebanon, the Jews of Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran? They were expelled. So enough with the hypocrisy. The word genocide is often, or carnage, is often thrown around here in a libelous context, as if it is something that happens every day or at all. But we, the Jewish people, know exactly what genocide looks like. We have experienced genocidal attempts and attacks more than once, from Hitler and the Mufti to the terror organizations that follow in their footsteps. And their name is not even mentioned here. Sadly, the Mufti's genocidal ideology continues to poison many Arab Muslim minds to this very day. It is the same ideology that Israel is currently defending itself against. An ideology that doesn't accept a Jewish state in any borders or the existence of Jews anywhere. The Palestinian Mufti is no different than Yihya Sinwar or Ismail Haniya. Their names are not mentioned here. They are not connected to these discussions. He is no different than Hassan Nasrallah, the Houthis, or the Ayatollahs in Iran. They are all the same, driven by the same goal of Israel's annihilation and the mass murder of Jews. It's time for the Security Council to address this evil before another atrocity is committed. Council members, on October 7th, Hamas massacring the most Jews in one day since the Holocaust. Yet, shockingly, here we are nearly 2 months later, and Hamas' savage crimes still have not been condemned by this body or any other UN body. How do you expect me to react to this? How would you react if a terror organization massacred thousands of your citizens, abducted hundreds of them, and the Security Council refused to condemn the terrorists? Hamas has publicly stated, you all saw it, that it will repeat October 7 over and over again until Israel is no more. How would you respond and defend your citizens from such a clear threat? With a ceasefire? How can one call for a ceasefire and at the same time claim to seek a solution to the conflict? After all, anyone who supports a ceasefire basically supports Hamas' continued reign of terror in Gaza. Hamas is a genocidal terror organization. They don't hide it. Not a reliable partner for peace. Don't you see the contradiction here? Calling for both a ceasefire and peace is a paradox. Colleagues, humanitarian aid is very, very important. But more food, water, and medical supplies will not bring us closer to a solution. Hamas doesn't care about the people in Gaza. All they are interested in is implementing Hitler's final solution. And nothing can change a genocidal ideology. It must be uprooted and eradicated. Every call for a ceasefire means Hamas gets to live to see another day, terrorizing Israelis and impoverishing Gazans. Every discussion focused only on humanitarian aid, which is extremely important, but ignores Hamas, the root of all the suffering in Gaza. Israel, as you all know, fully withdrew from Gaza 18 years ago. Not a single Israeli community or a soldier was left. Did Hamas cultivate Gaza after Israel's disengagement? Or did they invest every possible resource in terror and death? Look at their subterranean city of terror and their hundreds of kilometers of terror tunnels, billions and billions of dollars. How many schools, how many hospitals, How many power plants could have been built in Gaza if all funds, UN funds, were not diverted to terror? This Council must also not remain silent about the Shiite elephant in the room. Iran armed, Iran funded, Iran trained Hamas. But the Ayatollah regime's central role in the ruin of the region has not even been addressed here. It's not as if Hamas is fighting Israel alone. Hezbollah missiles have been raining down on northern Israeli towns, and Iran doesn't hide its aim of Israel's destruction. Iran publicly supports the October 7th massacre, what started everything. Does Iran's central role in destabilizing the security of the Middle East not deserve to even be raised here? It is clear that the UN has been co-opted by those that have no real interest in a solution. Every UN body has been weaponized against Israel. Today we will be hearing from some foreign ministers of countries that have not even condemned Hamas's massacre. Can we honestly expect them to provide a productive option? The only input that can be valued here is from parties that have condemned Hamas's massacre. This is the basic. Just look at what has been taking place at the UN over the past week. UN briefers from UNICEF did not even bother to mention Hamas's indoctrination of Gazan children to terror. UN women did not brief the Council on the savage rape and sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli women. And this entire week has been dedicated only to Palestinian solidarity, despite the fact that all of this started only because Hamas carried out a deliberate and unprovoked massacre of Israelis. On Monday, the Council held a private meeting focusing on the humanitarian situation in Gaza only. Yesterday, the General Assembly discussed the Palestinian question, and not once in the past 8 weeks has any of the UN's bodies held Hamas accountable for their war crimes. This only proves that advancing a real solution, sadly, is not the goal. Council members, from the day of Israel's establishment, we have shown that we are a willing partner for peace. 76 years ago, we accepted Resolution 181, while the Palestinians rejected it, just as they rejected every other peace plan ever presented, be it by Clinton, Obama, or any other president. Israel was delighted to sign the peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, the Abraham Accords. This is because Israel strives for peace, while the Palestinians strive for war, for terror. For them, the only solution, accepted solution, is one that prevents the existence of a Jewish state. Colleagues, Israel's value of preserving life can also be seen on the ground now in Gaza. Israel is upheld and even gone beyond the quotas of humanitarian aid entering Gaza. Israel has shown deep willingness to work with any international body to improve the situation. Israel has facilitated the entry of equipment to establish field hospitals. We have opened safe humanitarian corridors and approved the entry of fuel. Hamas has separated mothers from their children during the hostage release, in a clear breach of the agreed upon outline, all while threatening Gazans and preventing them from evacuating an active war zone. Hamas wants more violence. They want to raise Gazan casualties. Why? They want to exploit falsified death tolls just so this Council will ignore their crimes, focused on condemning Israel, and tie our hand. This is their script. Hamas knows that the international community is their only hope for survival. Mr. President, the only way to dramatically improve the situation is to support Israel's mission to eradicate Hamas's terror capabilities. I reiterate again and again and again, this war can end tomorrow, even today, if Hamas returns all of the hostages and turn in all the terrorists who took part in the massacre. a real ceasefire can be achieved that will last decades. Demand this of Hamas. This is the solution. The time has come for this Council to fully, truly focus on its mandate, security. Security. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢以色列代表的发
I
言。
thank the representative of Israel for their statement.
我现在以
I shall
中
now
华
make a
人民
statement in
共
my
和国
capacity
外交
as
部长的
member
身份，
as
代表中方
Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China.
秘书长先生、各位同事，
Mr. Secretary
我感谢
General,
古德
colleagues,
斯秘书长
I'd like to thank
和
Secretary
伊斯兰
General
德
Antonio
特别协调
Guterres
员
and
所做
Special
的公告。
Coordinator toward Venezuela
就
in
为实
Israeli
现和平奔
conflict,
走，
China has
为
all
挽
along
救
devoted
生
its
命
efforts to realizing peace and
习近平
saving
主
lives.
席多次就当前
President Xi
发言
Jinping
之
has
事
stated
阐明
China's
中方的
principled
原则，
position on the current
呼吁立
situation
即
on a number of
停火止
occasions.
战，
He
防
called
止
for an
冲突扩
immediate
大，
ceasefire and ending
保
the
障
fighting,
人道主义救援
preventing
通道
the expansion
安
of the
全畅
conflict,
通，
and ensuring
强
that the
调根本
humanitarian
出路
corridors are safe and
是落实
unimpeded.
两国方案，
He stressed that the fundamental
推
way
动巴勒
out
斯坦
lies in the
问题
two-state
早日得到
solution
全面、
and working
公
toward a
正、
comprehensive,
持久解
just,
决。
and lasting settlement of the Palestinian
中
question
国
at an early date.
作为安理会本月
As the
轮值
rotating
主席
president of the Security Council this
我们一直
month,
将巴
China
以
has
冲
all
突
along
作为最
taken
紧
the
迫的
Palestinian-Israeli conflict as the
安
most
理会本
urgent
月通
agenda.
过27
This month,
12号决
the
议，
Security Council
开启
adopted
了
Resolution
推动
2712,
停火的初
beginning
始步
initial steps toward a
决议
ceasefire.
通过后不久，
Soon
在
after
卡
the
塔尔、
adoption of the
埃及等
resolution under
斡
the
旋下，
mediation of
有
such
关各方
countries as
达成协
Qatar
议，
and Egypt,
实现了
relevant parties
部
agreed
分
to
被
and
扣押人员的
realized
释放
the release
和
of some
数亿的
persons
自由。
held captive and several days
这一
of
切虽
pause.
然来得晚
Although
了
all
一些，
this have
但
not
仍
come
然
at the
具有
earliest
重要意义。
time, they bear
这
important
也说明
significance.
对
This
话
also
谈判
shows
是
that
拯救生
dialogue
命
and
的
negotiation
最佳选项，是化解矛盾的根本之道。各位同事，本轮巴以冲突延宕至今，已经造成大量无辜生命消失和前所未有的人道主义灾难，其外溢影响还在持续显现。战争考验人类的良知与正义，和平呼唤我们的理性与智慧。站在战与和的十字路口，国际社会必须为拯救生命、恢复和平采取更积极的行动。第一，我们要以最大的紧迫感推动全面持久停火。炮火之下没有安全区，放任战事延宕，只会带来更多的死亡和破坏。加沙地带也没有防火墙，战火再度蔓延，很可能演变为吞噬整个地区的浩劫。巴以问题几十年的历史反复证明，狙击手段绝不是出路，以暴易暴只会加剧仇恨和对立，陷入无休止的恶性循环。中方强烈希望过去几天的暂时停火不是新一轮攻势前的间歇，而是进一步外交努力实现全面持久停火的开端。中方呼吁国际社会将全面持久停火作为压倒一切的优先任务，呼吁各方将全部努力汇集到平息加沙战火的共同目标上来。第二，我们要采取更加务实有力的行动，保护平民。武装冲突中保护平民，这是不可逾越的国际法红线。任何针对平民的暴力和袭击都不可接受。任何违反国际法，特别是国际人道法的行为，都应予以谴责。中方重申，反对针对加沙民众的集体惩罚，反对针对巴勒斯坦平民的强制迁徙。同样，所有被扣押的人员也都应该得到释放。缓解加沙地区的人道危机刻不容缓，必须全面落实安理会第2712号决议的要求，为充足的人道物资进入扫清障碍，为人道机构安全开展工作创造条件。目前仅靠拉法口岸向加沙运送人道物资远远不够，应当开辟更多通向加沙的救援通道， 联合国更大作用。冲突爆发后，中方向巴勒斯坦民族权利机构和联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处分别提供了现汇的援助，向加沙地带提供了粮食、药品等紧急人道主义物资援助。委员在此宣布，中国政府将再向加沙地带提供新一批紧急人道主义物资援助。第三，我们要以更坚定的决心重振两国方案政治前景。以色列早已独立建国，犹太民族不再颠沛流离，但巴勒斯坦人民的建国权、生存权、回归权却长期遭到漠视，这是巴以局势屡现动荡的症结所在。巴勒斯坦问题的公平正义就是两国方案，不可替代。只有两国方案真正全面落地，才能实现中东和平再出发，才能实现巴勒斯坦和以色列两个国家和平共处，阿拉伯和犹太两大民族共同发展。中方呼吁加大国际和地区外交努力，重塑可信的多边进程，重振两国方案的政治前景，重启巴以的直接谈判。我们倡议召开更具规模、更大范围、更有实效的国际和会。我们支持巴勒斯坦成为联合国正式会员国。任何针对当前危机的解决方案都不能背离两国方案，不能违背国际法准则和联合国相关决议。任何涉及巴勒斯坦前途命运的安排，都必须充分反映巴勒斯坦人民的意愿，照顾地区国家的合理关切。第四，我们要推动安理会采取负责任和有意义的行动。联合国宪章将维护国际和平与安全的首要责任赋予安理会。安理会必须在战与和、生与死的重大问题上体现责任和担当。安理会要倾听广大阿拉伯、伊斯兰国家的和国际社会的呼声，结合地面形势的发展，及时采取进一步的行动。中方提交了中国关于解决巴以冲突的立场文件，提出国际社会在推动全面停火止战、切实保护平民、确保人道救援、加大外交斡旋、通过落实两国方案寻求政治解决等5方面工作的原则和重点。中方将继续同有关各方加强协调，凝聚共识，推动安理会承担起应有的责任，为和平尽责，为正义发声。各位同事，今天的会议有很多阿拉伯、伊斯兰国家的高级别代表出席。此前，他们组成了外长联合代表团赴多国访问。我在北京同代表团深入交换了意见，他们的奔走斡旋，体现了结束加沙战事、实现中东和平的强烈愿望。今天的会议也承载了广大阿拉伯、伊斯兰国家对联合国、对安理会的热切的期盼。希望大家集思广益，同题共达，为早日停火止战、缓解人道危机、实现巴以和平共处、实现中东长治久安做出应有的贡献。谢谢各位。我现在继续行使安理会主席的职责。我现在请巴西外交部长维耶拉先生阁下发言。
我最近试了一个东西，真的很有用啊，所以要分享给大家，那就是太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌。吃了2-3天，真的有明显的感觉。最主要就是睡眠的品质变好喽。那你知道这个睡得好呢，整个人工作就可以更加的专注，当然情绪也就变得更好了。因为太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，我才认识了这个克菲尔益生菌。它是由多支菌种益生菌所组合而成的，不但是能够维护消化道机能的正常运作，而且呢还有多种有益健康的保健功能，非常的强大。 有台大教授专门研究它，把它叫做神仙的礼物。而您知道吗？有上千篇国际研究证实，克菲尔益生菌不仅是帮助肠道健康，肠道菌透过肠脑轴影响全身的器官，所以维持肠道菌种的平衡，这是解锁身体健康、精神健康的钥匙。对于帮助睡眠、维持好情绪，真的是很有感。也因为这不是药，有季节敏感、代谢困扰、关心恶性细胞风险的好朋友们，选择太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，做好日常的保养，身体轻轻松松，没有负担。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，也记得输入推荐码，有额外的折扣哦。